Ian Milhiser of Justice is the justice editor of Think Progress, the news site for the Center for American Progress. And he's the author of Injustices, the Supreme Court's history of comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. Now, we're going to give away 2 signed copies of his book, so just write in comments to enter. And the word that you have to write is court. Just write that word court in comments. But you have to like and follow our page to be eligible. Well, Ian Milhiser joins us now from Washington, D.C. with details about Injustices. Thanks for joining us, Ian, and taking the time.
It's good to be here. Thanks so much.
So, Ian, what was the impetus for this book?
Well, I guess the impetus was I was asked to work on the first case challenging the Affordable Care Act, the NFIB case. And I remember when I was first asked to work on it, my response was, well, I'm thrilled to do it, but is this really necessary? Like the idea that the Supreme Court would step in and overrule a massive economic regulation providing people with health care, that just wasn't on the table, or didn't seem like it was on the table back in 2009. And when the Supreme Court took that suit seriously, it made me realize that the other side has grown more ambitious. It made me realize that a lot of the past things that the Supreme Court did maybe 100 years ago that we thought were dead could very easily be revived. And if, Brett Kavanaugh joins the Supreme Court, I think we're going to be in for a world of hurt in terms of what the Supreme Court is going to do to people who aren't very rich and very white and very well off.
So, Ian, let's go back in time a little bit. Paint us a picture of what it was like for an average worker in the 1900s, right around the turn of the century.
Well, it was grim. I mean, you had legalized child labor. In some cases, you had children as young as 4 working in factories. The era of about 100 years ago is often referred to as the Lochner era, after a case called Lochner v. New York, which involved New York bakers. And the bakers in these bakeries would work in these terrible conditions. The floors would be rotting. Sometimes there would be raw sewage dripping from the ceiling. There would be roaches all over the walls. It would be hot because the ovens were going all the time. They would sometimes work 18-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, more than 100 hours a week. They would have to sleep on the very same benches where they were kneading the dough and making the bread. And they were paid a pittance for this. I mean, the equivalent of maybe $10,000 or $11,000 a year if they were lucky. And those were the conditions they got, I guess, in the free market. That's what they got without the government stepping in. What the Supreme Court said in the Lochner case is they said, oh, well, the government, you don't need the government to protect you because you have your own bargaining power. And so Lochner struck down a law that would have reduced their 100-hour work weeks to 60-hour work weeks. And the Supreme Court said, oh, no. If you can't negotiate for a 60-hour work week, if you can't negotiate that down, that's your own fault, because you should be able to negotiate. The government shouldn't step in to help.
Now, I saw a stat in there that just seemed awful to me. And I forget which chapter it was in, but it said something like 7,000 people died in boiler explosions in the U.S. between, I think it was 1883 and 1907. It's so hard to even comprehend now that was like a way of life back then.
Right. I mean, there's 2 things that have happened between now and then that have made it so that workers don't live in that world. One is unions. One is the fact that workers gain the ability to combine together and match the power of management by working collectively. And the other is law. The other is the fact that, we now have a minimum wage. We now have safety standards. We have, although workman's compensation, hasn't worked out as well in the modern era, it was better than what came before, which was if you get injured, tough. So we have laws protecting workers. And what's so frightening to me about the turn that the Supreme Court is taking right now, if you look at their civil rights cases, if you look at their forced arbitration cases, if you look at their efforts to dismantle unions, they're dismantling the systems that we built over the last 100 years to make sure we don't go back to that world where children are working in factories, where workers are working ungodly hours in squalid conditions, and where people's jobs just fundamentally are not safe.
I couldn't believe reading through it. I think one of the cases was Hammer versus Dagenhart, I think from 1918. You know, we've been looking at some of these pictures of children that were working at a very young age with child labor. Tell us a little bit about what Hammer versus Dagenhart decided.
Sure. So Hammer was a case involving Southern cotton mills. At the time, the South was very poor. And so the Northern capitalists moved their cotton mills to the South because they could go there and they could say to these poor farmers, you know, if you want to come work for us, you don't have any other options. So if you want to work for us, you can only come do that if you bring your children too. And so entire families would go into these cotton mills. Like I said, you'd have kids sometimes as young as 4 working there. Hammer v. Dagenhart was a case brought by these cotton mill owners to strike down a federal law that banned child labor. And so you had the Supreme Court of the United States saying that child labor was not something the federal government could do anything about. If you wanted to have a child labor law, you had to look to the states. And the states wouldn't enforce their labor laws. The reason they wouldn't enforce their labor laws is because North Carolina wanted to encourage those cotton mills to move from Massachusetts to North Carolina. And the way to encourage them to do that was to have lax child labor laws. That was actually an enticement that the southern states used in order to get people to move their factories into their state.
So now, today, I would think that if someone said, oh, your kids have to go to work, people would be up in arms.
Yeah, I mean, you would. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think it would be very tough to imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where 6-year-olds are working in factories. But these things happen gradually. I mean, I think that, the fact that we have the man in the White House right now, I mean, I don't think anyone could have imagined 5 years ago, much less 20 years ago, that we would be at the point where a Trump presidency would be realistic. If you look at the court's forced arbitration cases, where first they said that you could be forced to sign away your rights to sue someone if they sell your product and it doesn't work out, and then they said they could force you to sign away some of your rights in the workplace, and then they said they could make you sign away your rights to be free from anti-discrimination law, and they just said, very recently this past term, that your boss can literally say to you, you're not allowed to sue me in a real court. If I break the law, you have to go to this privatized arbitration forum where I'm going to pick the arbitrator, and if you don't agree to sign away all your rights to sue me if I break the law, you're fired. That's what the Supreme Court just said last term. That didn't happen overnight. That happened over the course of 30 years. So I think that, I mean, it is hard to imagine waking up tomorrow in a world that looks like what the world looked like 100 years ago. But I don't think it's impossible that we wake up in that world 40 years from now if we continue along the path that we're going down.
What do you think it's going to take to get through to people that this chipping away at our rights, and even the Voting Rights Act being gutted, what do you think it's going to do to get through to people that this is a real possibility, that we can go way backwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only 2 things we can do. We can talk about it. I mean, I can come on your show and I can scream it from the rooftops, and we need to make sure people know about it. We need to make sure that unions are warning their members about this. We need to make sure that politicians are warning their voters about this. And then the other thing we can do is vote. They haven't yet taken that away, although they are on that path. But the Supreme Court has not yet taken away that right. That means in 2018 people need to show out, in 2020 people need to turn out, and there is a way that we can put this on a different path and gradually slowly bring things back. But it's going to take a continuous effort. The way we got to this point, where Kavanaugh is about to come onto the court and gut our voting rights and gut the rights of people in the workplace, is that a whole lot of people on the other side, a whole lot of conservatives, a whole lot of managers, a whole lot of really wealthy people, they all got together and they worked really, really hard for a really long time. And the only thing we can do to fight back is all of us have to get together. It has to be a whole lot of us. And we have to work really, really hard for a really long time.
You talked about hope and turning things around. And before I ask you how you hold on to hope, if we go back to the Depression and FDR, he was able to turn things around economically. Can you talk a little bit about the end of the Lochner era and how FDR was able to turn things around? Because things could have been differently at the Supreme Court back then.
Right. I mean, we got lucky. So we got lucky because when the crisis hit and we got the Great Depression, FDR was elected. FDR, he viewed the president as a job that was about experimentation. He just kept trying things to try to fix the problem, and when it worked, he kept doing it. He had a Supreme Court that struck down a lot of that, but they had maybe a 5-4 majority, and one of them got spooked because FDR was very popular. So we got lucky in that the Supreme Court wasn't able to hold on to its opposition forever. We got lucky because we had a president that was looking to solve problems. And we also got lucky because we had a president who was still committed to the notion of us being a liberal democracy. I mean, FDR could have become a dictator under those circumstances, and that wasn't what he wanted. I mean, the way that a European friend of mine once explained the 1930s to me was, you got Roosevelt and we got Hitler. So, the danger when that crisis hits is that you're going to have some sort of massive change, and you don't know what that change is going to be. When people get desperate, they start reaching for new alternatives, and if you're lucky, they reach for someone like Roosevelt, and if you're unlucky, then things can get very bad very fast.
Yeah, we just had the picture up there of Justice Owen Roberts, and we were lucky that he switched his vote at the time that he did, or things could be much different today. Go ahead.
Well, so, I mean, what probably would have been different, Owen Roberts was the justice who said, okay, I'm going to stop blocking the New Deal now. If he hadn't done that, where we would have probably wound up is court packing. FDR said that he was going to add more justices to the court in order to allow our democracy to continue to function. And I guess now there's another justice named Roberts on the Supreme Court. And what I hope that he understands is that he has a choice to make too. I mean, I'm not expecting John Roberts to hand down all sorts of decisions that I like. But if we continue to have free and fair elections in this country, if we continue to have a system where we can resolve our disputes peacefully and through the democratic process, then I'm willing to fight him and his side in that arena. If he decides to push too far, he tries to hand conservatives permanent victories, then I think that you're going to see future presidents having to make very difficult decisions about how they deal with the court and whether they need to think about undermining the court's power in ways that haven't been on the table since the Roosevelt administration.
Ian, if we get back to basics, remind people what the fundamental role of the Supreme Court and the justices are.
Sure. Well, I mean, the fundamental role is to make sure that the law and the Constitution is enforced. And it's part of the reason that the court is so dangerous is because you can't not have a judiciary. Like you can't not have a body that's independent, that's, separated from political actors whose job is to just, apply the law to each case that comes up. But the problem that you have now is that this judiciary has become captured by a political movement. It's become captured by a very radical political movement. And so, when that happens, it's not a solution to just make it go away, but it could do considerable harm to our country and considerable harm to our democracy if it's left unchecked.
Ian, how do you personally hold on to hope for the future of this country and the court?
Well, I mean, I'm hopeful. I mean, people are energized right now. I look at the same polls that everyone else looks at. And at the end of the day, the way that we are going to solve this is getting more people to the polls than the other guys can. And that's what we have to hold out hope for, is that on election day, people are going to turn out and they're going to say, look, I don't want the world that Brett Kavanaugh wants. I don't want the world that John Roberts wants. And I'm going to keep turning out until we get a better world.
Thank you so much, Ian, for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, thank you for having me. Please, please buy the book. I hope it's interesting to folks.
I think it's a great book. When I started to read it, my dad kind of looked at it for a few minutes and he said he can't wait to read it. When it was missing, I knew what room it was in. So thank you, Ian. Ian's book is available on Amazon. Just search Injustices by Ian Milhiser. You can also find him on Twitter and Facebook, and you see his handles there, iMilhiser on Twitter, Ian Milhiser Public on Facebook, and the book is available on Amazon. And don't forget to enter our drawing for a signed copy of his book by writing the word court. We'll leave the drawing open until 9 a.m. Eastern this Friday, which is July 20th, and the drawing will be held next week on Activate Live, July 25th, after 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So good luck to all of you out there. It's a really good read.